little over 8 years old. So I'll tell you my journey, and maybe happy to discuss it over the next 2 days with anybody who wants. So life for me started like all boys in the 90s. I wanted to be a cricketer, okay, and didn't work out. I used to play cricket very seriously. I used to play cricket for Mumbai under 14, under 16, and my parents told me if I don't get 75% marks, cricket stops. So I used to get 76, 77, just do enough so that I could play. But the reason I start with this slide is because I still play cricket. It's a hobby. It's my way to get things, my mind off lab, and I encourage everybody to continue doing what you're doing when you start your lab for however long you run your lab. Okay, it helps you a lot. What cricket also taught me over the years is you learn winning, losing, you learn how to focus, because I was a wicket keeper. I had to focus when the ball is coming to me, but other times I could whistle and talk to people. So you learn to focus at short stretches, things like that. You learn patience, hard work, competition. I realized very early on in my life that there are so many people better than me at cricket. It also taught me teamwork, and it taught me that if you work with each other, it brings the best out of each other. And that's a general philosophy that I have in my lab also. Now, I don't know, the pointer is not working. Okay, so brief sort of CV of how I've ended up, where I've ended up. I wasn't very serious about studies till maybe 8, 9 standard, at which point my parents pulled me up, said, you're not playing cricket for India, so do something meaningful with your life. So they said, what are the options? Both my parents were doctors. I said, I don't want to become a doctor, I love sleeping. I need 8 hours of sleep, even today. So the option for me, I like biology, I like chemistry, I like a little bit of engineering. So I ended up in a school in Bombay called Unicity, where I did my chemical engineering. I got a B.Tech. At the end of 4 years, I realized I didn't want to do engineering anymore. Okay, but I still liked chemistry, I liked biology. So I enrolled in a PhD program. The pointer is not working, so you can just change, to all the transitions of this slide. Or maybe I can stand here and see. Is it working? Yes. Okay. So then I enrolled in a PhD program where I thought I'll start off doing synthetic organic chemistry. Okay? 2 years into my PhD, I realized I don't like synthetic organic chemistry, but I liked a little bit of biology. So I wanted a lab which did sort of both. And I ended up doing a PhD in partially synthetic organic chemistry, largely biochemistry. Then I went to Scripps for a postdoc, where I ended up in a lab which used chemical tools to study physiology and metabolism. And after that, I've been at IISER Pune, where I was first an assistant professor and now I'm an associate professor. And over the years, as you can see from my so-called skill sets, I started off with a very soft chemical engineering background. I had some sort of introduction into synthetic organic chemistry, biochemistry, and physiology and metabolism. So I use all these aspects that I've learned over the years into what we do in lab. Now, my PhD was with this gentleman, Frank Rochelle. I really admire him because he chose to take a risk on me. I came from an engineering background, never seen a pipette in my life, didn't know how to operate a pipette at the start of my PhD, and he still decided to sort of take me into his lab and deal with me. An interesting thing is when one enters a PhD lab, so my PhD was at Texas A&M, and when I entered the PhD program, there are these entrance exams that one has to give to figure out what you have an aptitude in, and I failed in all of them. So I didn't have an aptitude in chemistry or biochemistry or anything. So I went very sheepishly to him and I told him that I failed all these exams. What do I do? And he said, good, you have to learn, let's learn. So he downplayed it, I was very depressed that I was not going to get a PhD lab, I'm going to be thrown back, I'm going to go back to India or whatever. But he said, okay, you come, work with me, we'll do something. So my PhD again was an interesting journey. I was given the task of purifying a protein. For a guy who has never touched a pipette, for the first 2 years I just kept purifying dead protein day in, day out. But I became very good at purifying proteins at the end of 2 years. The first 2 years were terrible. I didn't know what I was doing. I was purifying dead proteins. And I had a chat with everybody, like, this is going nowhere, what do I do? I think I'm doing everything right. I'm getting a lot of protein, but it's dead. So he said, why don't you figure out why this protein is dead? And maybe that will help you. So I was able to figure out why that protein was dead. And magically the last 2 years of my PhD, everything I touched worked. And it ended up giving me really good papers at the end of my PhD. And it gave me a lot of confidence that I can do biology. Because till that point I didn't have any real exposure to biology. Now, I went for a postdoc. So Frank's lab had about 10 people, maybe 8 PhD students, a postdoc and a technician. After that I went to Ben's lab at Scripps. And Ben's lab at Scripps basically was a huge lab. It had about 50 people, 40 postdocs, 8, 9 PhD students, few technicians, a huge lab. The advantage I had in Ben's lab was that I never had to think about money when doing an experiment. If you thought of an experiment, just do it. Okay? The second thing Ben allowed me to do was he allowed me to write grants and sort of build my own lab within his lab. So it gave me sort of a way to deal with people, figure out what I am good at, how I can deal with people. And what I learned in Ben's lab was you have to learn things very fast. There's a very sharp learning curve and you have to be up to speed. Okay? What Ben's lab also did for me is it gave me a first clear taste of biology. So I started doing experiments in mice. I started doing experiments in human-derived cells and things like that, which I never thought I would ever be doing. It also gave me a taste of mass spectrometry, a technique that is very, very heavily used in my lab, and I realized the importance of this technique during my postdoc. And it also gave me a taste of working with lipids, something we routinely do in our lab. Okay, so I had different sorts of training experiences that got me started with my individual lab. Another advice Ben gave me, okay, and maybe not all postdoc advisors do this now. He told me you need to get out of here soon. If you don't get out of here, if you don't learn anything in 2-3 years here, you've learned nothing at all. So by the time I was done with my postdoc and started my lab, I was 30. Okay, so I also remember the time, my last year in my postdoc, I was partially still doing my postdoc, but I was also talking a lot to Shashi, who was at ICER, and Shashi sort of was remotely helping me set up my lab in ICER. So I was doing 2 jobs in the last 6-7 months of my postdoc. Okay, maybe some of you all might do it when you all are at that stage. Okay, so this is the only science slide I have. I'm just giving you a flavor of what science we do in lab, and that's our website, so you can follow our science. It's very up to date. So my lab does a lot of technology development around mass spec. We work a lot with lipids, so we do a lot of lipidomics. We also work with chemical probes, so we work on these techniques called chemical proteomics. We do a lot of studies in animal cell models. We do a lot of sort of traditional biochemistry, mechanistic enzymology. We also do some synthesis. And the goal for us is to use all these approaches to find some sort of new biology associated with human diseases, still very, very basic science. And also, if possible, whether we can translate this into new therapy. So that's the long-term goal. Now, I'll come to sort of more philosophical things or things that I'm expected to talk to you as mentor. So, what are the expectations when one starts the lab? Okay, when one starts the lab, I have the expectations that I will do good research, I will publish well, I will try to get tenure, I will not be awful at teaching, because I never taught up to that point. And I will try to be independent in terms of my research from my PhD or postdoc advisors as soon as I can. Okay, so these were sort of the 5 things I set up a priori before I started my lab. Now what happened in reality is the following. I spent an enormous amount of time managing students. Managing human beings takes skill, especially if you want to bring the best out of them. And I realized that very early on. So I spent a lot of time with students trying to get the best out of them. Because if they did their job well, research was doing well overall. The second thing I figured out that was a challenge was generating money to sustain what we are doing. When I joined ICER, the department did not have any mass specs. So I had to set up facilities to get them up and running, get mass specs up and running for our research. I also decided, because I didn't have any sort of background with my PhD or postdoc in India, it also became important for me to engage with the Indian science community and figure out what sort of programs we can build on and what are long-term plans for everywhere. And then, last two things were teaching and research. Because research was something I was naturally doing, it came naturally. All these other things took some skills. And I started my lab, fooling 3 people to join in 2016, and now my lab has grown a lot. Okay, so I started off with very few set of people, and now you can see my lab has almost 20 people, a large proportion of which are undergrads at ICER. Okay, so I started working on the PhD students, now I work with a whole bunch of different people. Alright, now selecting an institute, this may be relevant for all the postdocs here, more so than the young starting PIs. So please bear with me for a slide. So when I was interviewing, I interviewed at 4 places. ICER Pune, TIFR Mumbai, the biochemistry department at IISc and NCBS. And I ended up getting offers from all 4 of them. And then I started figuring out, what is the best suit for me and why. So I had to take into account what would be my lab requirements. I would need general biology space, I would need some chemistry space, I would need an animal house to do some animal experiments, and maybe set up facilities and have some scope of expansion of these facilities. And so that immediately ruled out a few places for me. Okay. The next thing I saw was what are other professional factors that are going to help me grow. Whether the institute has good leadership, whether the institute has colleagues that foster growth of people, and whether it has enough infrastructure for me to start doing things. And the last thing, as we've heard from the previous talk, is I don't know why we call it a two-body problem. We should call it a two-body opportunity. I really don't know why it's a problem. But the other personal considerations for me was sort of my wife's job, proximity to family and friends. Okay, so all of this is something I considered when I was sort of taking a call on where should I go. And I had very honest conversations with Shashi, who was at ICER. And I must have bored him for a couple of hours on the phone several times. And 2 things that Shashi said stuck with me. The first thing he said is, if an institute is going to hire you, they're going to do everything to ensure you succeed. So no institute is going to hire you and keep you stagnant. All institutes that want you to come there and do well. So if an institute is interested in you, please remember they want you to come there and do well. The second thing he said, and this was largely because I was not sure whether I wanted to come back to India, because I had some offers in the US. And Shashi told me, if you're coming back to India, come with a one-way ticket. The first 4-5 months are going to be frustrating. But I can assure you things will work out, and they have. So, for all those of you who are in that boat, this is serious advice that I got from him and it worked for me. Okay, and I passed out the same advice to you, giving him the copyrights. So, the next thing, so I had a job now at ICER Pune, but I didn't have a biology background like most traditional biologists in that department. So, it sort of bothered me for the first year or so. I was trying hard to fit in. And I was, I had certain questions. For example, I'm a non-biologist. I don't understand all these pathways. I never understood these pathways. I don't know a lot of techniques, terminologies. I've never done RNA-seq. I've never done a whole bunch of things that traditional biologists would do. the question that plagued me for a very long time through any talk I gave in the biology department was, what is the cellular localization? And my answer was, why do I care? Most of the times, you know. So those were the sort of questions I always had. And, you know, a lot of people started asking me mechanisms and whether this is correct and this. And what that ended up doing for me is it started causing me a lot of stress and giving me, you know, existential crisis. So what I decided to do at the end of my first year is I said, I'm going to do research my way. I've had enough, I'm not fitting in, I will do things my way. I will report great results because I'm a chemical biologist and a lot of the things we do pharmacologically or otherwise have off targets, things are not black and white. It's okay to be reporting things which generally the community accepted it. I also decided that the unique thing that I bring to the department is looking at biology like a chemist. And I should continue doing that, I should not change. And the other things we sort of decided to do proactively as a lab is we do a lot of technology with mass spec, and whether we can help the community, whether we can develop collaborative projects, and now that has sort of become almost 50% of projects in my lab. And another thing I found, another thing that has come up from the discussions so far is don't feel shy to talk. I'm done?
You have 10 minutes.
Okay. So another thing that has come up over discussions is don't feel shy to talk to people. And one of the persons I talked to a lot when I had these crises was Roop. And Roop, just like me, is a physicist trying to do biology. So, we overlap a lot, we collaborate a lot, and I used to talk to him a lot about these problems. And he used to tell me, kuch nahi hoga, tum karte jao. Log aayenge, tension mat lo. So he was very good to talk to. So always find somebody to talk to when you have problems. You're never alone. There is always somebody out there you can talk to. Alright? Now, the next thing is how I built my lab. So, what I realized from Ben's lab is that you can have ideas, but you really need people to drive ideas, and you need good people to drive these ideas. So selection of people in your lab is a very important thing you're going to do. Don't randomly take people just because they say good things about you. Everybody's going to say good things about you when they want to join a lab. You have to make a choice on who you want in a lab and why you want that person in a lab. And these are certain things I sort of decided on. I decided that I'm never going to have more than 10 PhD students in my lab. I cannot handle any more than that. I also decided that the phenotype of people I like are people who come with a lot of energy, willing to take risks, and have a strong inclination towards something that is not centered to the lab. For example, I've had students who had an inclination to do neurobiology using the tools we develop in lab, or immunology using the tools we develop in lab. I really like such students. I also decided that I initially will not work with undergrads because it takes a lot of energy, but over time I will sort of take undergrad. Another thing I do in my lab very consciously is have a 50-50 gender balance. So I will make sure that there are equal number of men and women in the lab, such that there is no bias of any sort when we are doing things. The other consideration for me was space and infrastructure. How many instruments are we going to need? How much space are we going to need? How are we going to expand over time, etc., etc. And how involved does one want to be? So when I started my lab, I was very involved. I was doing experiments. I was doing experiments with the students, but I made a conscious decision that at 1.5 years after setting my lab, I'm not going to do any experiments. My lab is not going to collapse. I have to let students do all the experiments. That's the only way peer learning culture in lab will develop, and I am free to do some other things like write grants or write papers, focus on teaching, focus on collaboration. And that worked out very well for me. So just again, a sort of chronology of how our lab grew. So when I started in 2016, I had 3 PhD students, and we were still setting up the lab. We had no mass specs. I was still doing experiments. Now, 2018, I had sort of doubled the lab size in terms of number of PhD students. We also managed to get some postdocs who were really good. They helped set up the lab. getting postdocs in India is slightly challenging. It's difficult to get them, but if you get them, they're very, very good. I've had very good experiences with postdocs. We also managed to get one mass spec for the lab, and that sort of helped us get up and running over this time. Then, we were still expanding a little bit, so I still recruited more PhD students, wrote more grants, got more mass specs. And then, over the last few years, we've sort of reached a steady state in terms of number of students. I don't do any experiments in the lab, so So we've sort of reached a steady state in terms of number of people in lab. I also don't do too many experiments anymore, but I'm writing a lot of grants and trying to see if we can get more infrastructure, get more systems for students to work with, etc., upgrade old systems. So that's sort of the trajectory of how my lab has grown over the years. Now, in terms of securing funding, which is, I think, the second most important thing after dealing with people, is you need to figure out what is an appropriate budget for your lab. And trust me, it will take you at least 3 years to figure this out. Because the first year, you will blow up whatever money you have. The second year, you're going to be extremely cautious about money. And only by the third year, you'll realize that this is the amount of money I need to run my lab properly. Okay? So everybody's going to make that mistake. Please make that mistake. That's the only way you will learn. One more advice I got from both Shashi and Sanjeev is if you have money, spend it. It is not going to grow and give you interest. The government or other funding agencies will in fact take it back. So when you have money, spend it. Okay, that's a very important advice I got very earlier. And so you need to take into account all these factors, at least I did when I was setting up my lab. And the way I sort of manage lab funding is the following. At any given point, I would have a big grant, which is sort of a 5-year grant. We initially had the India Alliance Intermediate Fellowship. The lab is currently supported by the Swarna Jayanti Fellowship. We also have occasional small grants to sort of buffer between time funds are released from a big grant. So I've had grants from SERB, I've had some industrial money from MERD, I've had some funding from EMBO, so that sort of helps you in times of emergency. And we also want to look at collaborative equipment grants, especially if you're a lab that's going to rely heavily on equipment and that sort of infrastructure. So we have had funding from ICMR, DBT, DST, all of them, over the years to sort of build up our mass spec capability. Okay. Third most important thing, publishing. Okay. Now, publishing is, I'll finish in 2 minutes. Publishing is important because it is going to help you with tenure, promotion, getting grant, getting visibility. It is also important to let the community know what you're doing. The third most important thing is you need to realize how good your paper is. Read your paper like your enemy would. Only then you'll realize that it's not fit for nature, cell or science. There is no downside to publishing in standard society journals. My lab does that routinely. It's worked very well for us. Doing this consistently is more important. Okay, so please do that. And don't go from Leonardo from Titanic to Leonardo in The Revenant when you write a paper. So, ensure it's done in a reasonable time frame. Okay, I'll just quickly skip through this, but it is very important to, as she said, finding right mentors who give you honest advice. Everybody is going to make mistakes, but please find people who are going to tell you things honestly to your face. And for me, there are 2 people who still do that for me at ISER Pune. One of them is Girish and the other is Hari. We sort of even have joint students now, and I made a lot of mistakes and they've honestly told me what mistakes I made and how I can improve from them, especially when you start. Now, the last slide, give me 1 minute. There are reasons people are going to have stress. I told you about fitting in. I told you about students. I told you about tenure and papers. Another thing that also plagues a lot of Indian scientists is awards. Don't lose any sleep over them. They will come if you're doing good work. Administrative work is totally your choice. You can say no to any sort of administrative work, especially early on in your career. Starting a family is going to be a reason for stress for a lot of y'all. There is no good time, there's always a good time. So please, I had both my kids after I started my lab. One of them was born in 2018, the other is 2022. So I have 2 young kids. I'm managing lab, I'm also managing them. So it works out. Also, please take a break. You always need time for yourself. Don't get obsessed with your lab. And lastly, please don't feel shy to talk to anybody. The more you talk, the more you realize that things are simpler and there is always somebody like you out there who can help. So that's all I have. Sorry for going a couple of minutes over time. Happy to take any questions.